Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the second tournament, the Grand Prix 2019. This one's being held in Latvia. We are in round 3, which means there are 4 players left. In each of the Grand Prix tournaments, there's 16 players, and they play heads up against one opponent. They play a best of 2 series, and then the winner will move on. If there's a tie, they go to tiebreakers, but we are down to 4. Playing heads up, and then we will have a finals after this round 3. The 4 people left: Alexander Grishuk, MVL, Shakir Mamedyarov, and Wesley So. Today we're going to be looking at a game from Shakir and Wesley So. Shakir playing the white pieces and Wesley So playing the black pieces. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Starts out with d4, knight to f6, c4, pawn e6, knight f3, and then after pawn d5, pawn g3. So this is the Catalan opening, the open classical line in the Catalan opening. We don't see as much Catalan opening nowadays, so always good to see it at these high level play. Bishop to e7, bishop g2, castle on the king side, castle, and then the pawn takes on c4. And this is really the thought behind the opening for white, giving up this pawn earlier into the game. This light square bishop being here on g2 controls this entire light square diagonal, and because the pawn's no longer blocking it, depending on where this knight moves to, this can really hamper black's development on the queen side of the board, which usually in this opening you're going to castle on the king side, and you're going to look to develop on the queen side right away. This does stop that threat. Now there's a few ways that white can come back and get this material. If he wants to play queen to c2, this is pretty common. Knight to a3 at some point attacking this pawn. It's very difficult for black to hold on to this pawn here as far as the material. So although white has given up some material, can always get back that material at some point. Decides to not worry about the material right away, continues with his plan of developing quicker than his opponent. His opponent does have that move down that he gave up to capture this material right here. So knight to e5, this also attacks the pawn on c4. Wesley So decides to go and bring knight to c6, which after the recapture here, very easy for just bishop takes on c6. And this is the most common that I would expect for anyone playing in this variation. Other things you could see would be pawn b3. This is one option, although you're not going to see it too often. You could always get the queen involved into the game if you want to, but really bishop to c6. This is why you play this. What I was not expecting to see is what Shakir played, and that is knight to a3. Yes, this is attacking the pawn, but you're essentially just telling your opponent to take here on a3, which is what Wesley So does. And then after the recapture, you now have double pawns on the a file. Interesting move. Definitely don't see this all too often. After pawn takes on a3, we see bishop to a6. And the main reason we see bishop to a6 is wants to hold on to the material as much as possible. Bishop to b7 doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot. Queen to a4. This is now double attacking this pawn here. The bishop on g2 still attacking the pawn. Now the queen attacking. But then this is also attacking the pawn on c4. So yeah, if you want to try to hold on to this, maybe with your queen, you're still going to lose this material right here, because you can't bring your queen down to d5. It would fall to the bishop on g2. So because of that, black recognizes and just decides, okay, I can't hold on to this pawn right here. I'll go ahead and bring my bishop down to a6, try to hold on to the pawn on c4. Queen to d2, rook b8 says let's just try to control this open file here. Queen to a5, attacking the bishop. Rook comes down to b6, defending this bishop right here. Pawn to a4, queen to d6, just centralizing the queen. Had a few options. Could have also played queen to e7, then swung his rook over here to d8, trying to control this semi-open file. But queen to d6, definitely a good centralizing move for the queen, making sure that the most important piece right here is involved. And they can always swing his rook over here to d8 if he wants to. Pawn to a3, rook to b8, doubling up on the b file here. And then e4. And this is a critical place in the game. White's now looking to push up in the board. After pawn to e4, he's threatening the move pawn to e5, which I think is a critical move to try to avoid. With this, I would expect to see queen to d7. We did not see that in the game. we saw the move pawn c3. Now this is a discovered attack with the bishop taking on the rook on f1, but I'm not sure that this is the approach that Wesley So wants to go down. Pawn to e5 is exactly what we see. The queen comes back, doesn't want that to fall. The knight's going to fall. First decides, yeah, I got to go ahead and take that. Bishop takes on f1. Bishop recaptures. Do not want to recapture with your king. So always looking at how sides are going to recapture is important. If the king takes, then queen comes down, capture the pawn here on d4. And this is really threatening the move queen to d1, checkmate. There's no real way to stop this. Maybe king to g1, rook down b1. This is threatening first taking here, but if there is a recapture, now this is threatening rook to c1. There's no real great way to stop this. There could be lots of variations here, but at the end of the day, it's not going to end extremely well for white. So if we come back, you do not want to take with the king there, and so rightfully took with the bishop on f1. Pawn c2 tries to save things, but really it's just not that great of a move. This pawn is going to fall. It was putting a lot of pressure and was well defended. Now it's just going to be a lost piece here. Rook to a2. Queen comes down on d5. We do see the exchange right here. Pawn recapture, so it does help the pawn chain a little bit, knowing that the pawn's going to be recaptured, no longer has double or triple pawns as he had on the c file. But after the pawn recaptures, this is getting into the endgame. Both sides have a good amount of material, but you can see here that white has some pretty active pieces. And usually if you have two rooks, that's going to be extremely good, but you don't want so many pawns on the board. These rooks are really going to have to work together if Wesley So wants to end up with a good endgame. From white's standpoint, these bishops are going to be able to move around the board more so than the rooks because the rooks are just blocked off by all of the pawns on the board. Rook takes on c7 to equalize as far as the pawns, but since he has two bishops generally being worth 3 points, the rooks being worth 5 points. The white's up slightly from a material standpoint. Black also has the double pawns here on the f-file, so white has a small advantage. It's going to come down to Wesley So if he can get his double rooks, use them to his advantage, and see if he can pick off some of these pawns, get into the endgame in a much favorable position. Wesley So continues with rook to b7. Rook down here, c5, king g7, both sides getting their kings involved into the game now that the queens are off the board. Bishop to b5, and this is a really good square because it blocks off these two rooks from working with each other. And as soon as they can no longer work together, it's going to be very difficult for Wesley So to find a win here. The bishop is being defended by the rook. Can't really do too much. Tries to swing over here to a1 to pick off this pawn. Rook to c3, now playing double duty here, defending both the pawn on a3 and the bishop on c1. Rook to b6, a bishop to f4, just centralizing that, knowing that wasn't really doing too much here on c1. Wants to start to attack some of the squares that black could go to. King to f3, getting involved into the game. Rook to d1, knowing that it's not going to threaten this pawn right here. Wants to start attacking some of the other material. Bishop to e3, defending that material. Rook over here, b1, but it's all by himself. There's just no way for this rook to do anything. King to g4, rook to h1, attacking the pawn. Pawn h4. King g6, now the bishop centralizes with d3, check. And then pawn f5, king to f3, rook over here, d1, just attacking the pawn, but it's still defended, can't really do too much. Pawn g4, and at this spot, Wesley So decides to go ahead and resign. Wish he would have played a little bit longer. Yes, he is down as far as material, but not by much. And yes, he does need to get his rooks playing a little bit better together, because right now they're going around trying to attack, and white just has so much material to defend against one sole rook here. But it's not an easy endgame. You could definitely have your opponent make a small mistake and you could find a draw here. Wesley So decides not so much today and resigns, hoping that he can come back tomorrow. But he does have his work cut out for him. Anytime a player knows that all they have to do is go in and get a draw to move on to the finals, it's just much easier for preparation. Many players, when they take a line in an opening, they try to keep themselves pretty open because they don't know if their opponents can make a mistake, and they want to have some chances to win if they do. If you know you're going to draw, you can play specific lines that are very drawish and hard for your opponents to ever find anything, because you play these many times over, and you know there's no way for you to win, but there's also very limited ways for your opponent to win. So Shakir, congratulations to him on the victory today. He's going to be going in tomorrow looking for at least a draw, and he will be moving on to the finals. In the other game, Alexander Grishuk and MVL, they did draw. So if someone wins tomorrow, they will also be going into the finals. Thank you guys so much for watching this game, and we will be back tomorrow for round number 3, game number 2. Thanks for watching. Bye.